Normally, for these types of stories, you would get a little backstory about the narrator. You know, he or she would try to convince you of their trustworthiness, their mental stability, and most of all, that he or she is a good person to which bad shit just happened. Well, I'm a lot of things, but lying isn't my best ability. Besides, I'm not what's important here. What's important is the knowledge that I possess and want to pass on to you. If you're like most people, you live in, or close to a community where someone has disappeared. I mean, disappeared like they just vanished off the face of the earth. No trace of them is ever found. In my neighborhood, people go missing on a regular basis, but they're usually found later, whether alive or dead. But rarely do they ever just vanish as if the hand of God just snatched them off the planet, leaving no evidence. People, as a general rule, are sloppy when it comes to disappearing, or when it comes to killing another person. They leave clues of some kind behind. Now, my neighborhood isn't the best, but it's also not the worst. Back in the day, when the car factories were thriving, this was a good neighborhood. But nowadays, only every third or fourth house is occupied. Empty factories and office buildings stand as bleak reminders of better times. They serve as tombstones, marking the place where life used to be abundant, where people used to go to work every day to support their families, and where futures were born. Now there are drugs and hookers, squatters and thieves, underground illegal porn studios and corrupt officials. To say the least, a disappearance or two would be expected every now and then. I'm one of the luckier people around here as far as finances go, although I won't fully disclose exactly how much money though. My house was built back in the 80s, when worries over the Cold War led many to construct fallout shelters and such under their properties. Most people around here don't know that my 2-story brick is just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. I have more square feet underground than above. Mostly, I used the secret rooms to be safe while I was getting high or drunk off of my ass. That is, well, till last year, after the incident. I don't know how safe it really is down there. I don't know how safe it really is anywhere anymore. It's amazing how a man can adapt to live with terror gnawing at his gut and mind all the time. With some knowledge, all a man's mind can do is accept it and move forward, adjust or break. I prefer to adjust, although sometimes I think it would be easier if I had chosen the alternative. So this was a random evening in the spring of last year. Michigan weather doesn't play nice until June, in my opinion. It's just cold and wet enough to be a real pain in the ass. I was shot twice in the back a long time ago. I lost a kidney and a section of intestine to the first bullet, and part of my hip joint to the second. Spring weather, well, it's not my friend, but the booze and the drugs help. Needless to say, I spent a lot of time underground in my safe and secret lair during that time, which is exactly what I was doing that evening. I was hopped up on painkillers and acid. Chilling in my man cave, I was watching an old horror flick on a VH tape. Yeah, I still have a VCR and hundreds of movies on tape. After being down there for about 24 hours, more or less, I was coming down a little and I got the munchies, which meant a trip to the house's cellar, which was connected to a shelter via a short cinder block and concrete passage. And generally, I don't dip into the food stores of the shelter except to rotate out the stuff that's running close to an expiration date. So, I went to the basement for my food. I lumbered toward the tunnel, trying to clear my head enough to decide what I wanted to eat. I had a whole shelf dedicated to Dinty Moore beef stew and Budweiser just to the left as I stepped into the cellar. There was only the one obligatory bare bulb hanging in the center of the basement, and the crappy lighting left the outer edges of the room in darkness. Grabbing a can of beef stew, I bent to grab a 6-pack of bud, and the pain in my back lit up like a neon stop sign, nearly taking me to my knees. I braced against the shelf and hooked the rings around the beer cans with one finger, hauling it up and cradling it against my stomach. Starting for the tunnel again, I heard the crunching noise that caused me to drop my food and beer, grab for the gun I usually kept in the back of my pants, and turn. But I didn't have the gun, and there was a moment of panic. And then I saw the man, or the thing that resembled a man. And after a moment of shock, I laughed as he stared at me with a disinterested look. This man thing was sitting cross-legged on the floor, humped over and eating something. Its shoulders were really close to the 7-foot-high ceiling, so there was no way it was real. I was hallucinating. It wouldn't have been the first time. As it stared, I got a hot, sick feeling in my gut. If it was a hallucination, it was very detailed. Its shadow moved on the wall behind it, and its nose shunted slightly to one side, as if it had been broken at some point and healed back crooked. Its enormous toes wiggled slowly up and down as it chewed on its food. It took another bite, and there was a loud crunch. Something dribbled down its chin, and it swiped at it with his forearm. I laughed again when it belched. When the horrid stench of its rotten breath hit me, I stopped laughing. How bad was this acid trip? I backed up, keeping my eyes on it, and picked up my food and beer. I held the beer up, as if showing it what I had come for, and chuckled. The creature leaned forward, stretched out an impossibly large, long arm, reached between two shelves, and dragged something back to it, held it up, and shook it at me, imitating my chuckle in a much, much lower voice. The thing it shook at me looked like the lower leg of a kid. Beef stew for acid trip monsters, I thought as I backed out of the room and pushed the door closed gently. I went back to my comfortable recliner and ate my beef stew right from the can. I drank only 3 beers. After the ungodly creature I had just seen lurking in my basement, I figured it was time to sober up. I slept in the recliner long enough that it took me 20 minutes to be able to stand. I really wanted to self-medicate again to stave off the pain, but I wanted even more to check the basement. I had to make sure that my cellar was clear of all monsters, real or imagined. A bad trip can make a regular person look like a demon. I've had a few bad trips. I'm an old hat at that game. I took an LED flashlight with me. The basement didn't harbor any human-eating giants, and I was satisfied that it was all normal. Then, my light glinted off something shiny that lay partially hidden under a bottom shelf. Instead of bending over, I took a knee and dragged the silvery thing to me. It was a thick silver medical alert bracelet. Chain was broken. A blood smear obscured the name on the bracelet. I rubbed it against the knee on my jeans and then I read it. Bruce Whitby. I had heard part of the news broadcasts about him. They were on almost every day, it seemed. The kid had disappeared into thin air one day from its parents' home. He was 12, and according to the bracelet, he was deathly allergic to penicillin. He had disappeared from the living room as he watched television. One second, he was there on the sofa. The next, he was gone. The parents were naturally suspected of foul play, and after the investigation, though, there was nothing the cops could do except for scratch their heads. There was no physical evidence that the parents had done anything wrong. Why the hell was this kid's medical alert bracelet in my basement? Did I call the police? Well, you better believe I most certainly did not. You see, people like me, we don't call the cops to their homes. Hell, people like me don't call the cops at all. I took the bracelet back to the room and dropped it on the side table. I ventured up to the house afterward, checked that no one had broken in. Everything was kosher. None of the alarms had been tripped, so I didn't really think anyone had come in. But when you find a missing kid's bracelet in your basement, you gotta make sure. After the next few days, I dwelled on the matter. Had a giant eaten a kid in my basement? I wasn't ready to say that. There was only one way in and out, and I was the only one who had the passcodes to the alarms. If someone had come in after I had, the shelter rooms would have lit up like a laser light show at a rave. The alarms had a silent setting that only showed flashing lights as alerts, but I had mine set to the screaming, warbling blare plus the lights. If I'm down there, it takes more than flashing lights to slap me out of my drug and alcohol-induced sleep. All that negated the possibility that a giant had blundered into the basement too. That left only one possibility, and, well, I didn't like it. Did I take the kid? Did I do something that terrible? Now, I'm not a good person, but I'm also not evil. I was completely sober. Not even a beer for nearly a week. And then, well, I saw that giant man again. This time, he was crawling into the nook where the water heater stood. Now, I did have my gun that day. Without hesitation, I shot off 3 quick rounds before his giant ass disappeared around the corner. My ears rang and I could still hear his howl of pain as I ran toward the wall that separated that nook from the rest of the basement. The sound faded and was gone by the time I turned that corner with my gun at the ready. Only the water heater stood there. Now, I hadn't been near the thing in probably 3 years. I had no good reason. Taking out my LED light, I shone the beam around the floor until I found droplets of blood. I had wounded the thing. That blood proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the giant was real. Imaginary monsters didn't leave blood trails. I followed the droplets behind the water heater and was truly shocked that there was a large hole in the wall of concrete behind it. The hole was large enough for that creature to army crawl through, but that was about it. Whoever heard of a tunneling giant? I took my time and set my head straight about the new discovery. It didn't take as long as you might think, and this is where my mind just accepted the fact that I had a giant to deal with and moved forward with the plan. I couldn't leave it alone. I couldn't block up the hole and just hope he didn't return. He had already invaded my home through a cinder block and concrete wall. I also couldn't leave him to eat another kid in my basement. There was no one I could call to come and help me either. I mean, would you believe your friend if he called one day and said, "Hey, dude, there's a kid-eating giant using my basement for his dining room. Would you care to grab a gun and come on over so we could track him down and kill him?" Yeah, exactly. So I grabbed 2 more clips from my gun and a brighter light. Then I went back and entered the giant's tunnel. After crawling for only a few yards, the tunnel suddenly became big enough for me to stand in. As a matter of fact, the giant could have stood up in it. It sloped downward and I followed the path until it opened into an enormous cave. Crude cages lined the wall opposite me. Small fires ringed the entire room, making misshapen shadows cavort along the walls and across the cages. The smell of burning wood and something rotten filled my nose and I gagged as I lurked near the opening. Claws struggled for purchase on the rocks to my right was accompanied by snarling and growling that echoed. I stepped back into the tunnel with my back against the wall, holding my breath. A creature that stood nearly twice my height stalked past the opening. Patches of dark fur covered part of its head, its groin, lower legs, and feet. The rest of it was piebald flesh. The face was seriously deformed. The closest I could come to describing it was that it looked like a human-dog hybrid, I couldn't decide which face to wear, so it mushed them both into one. More creatures, all similar to the first, appeared. They each went to one of the fires around the room and hunkered down, as if waiting on something. The air was filled with their combined foul stench, and their guttural snarls and yips. I was in way over my head. Those things looked way worse than the giant man. I looked at my gun and back to them. Even if I had a dozen clips for the gun, there was no way I would stand a chance against them. The giant man appeared from the far side of the cave. He held a struggling kid under one arm. He walked toward one of the creatures and kind of just tossed that kid toward the growling beasts. The kid didn't make a sound as the creature snagged it with its long black claws and dragged it to the floor. Now, this is probably the part where most of you think, aha, he rushes in with his gun and saves the kid. He's not such a bad man after all. Well, you'd be wrong though. I didn't. You see, self-preservation is a hard instinct to overcome, even in the face of something so vile as those creatures. I wanted to, but I couldn't make my legs move me in that direction. The giant man went back to the cages and came back hauling what looked like a young woman. Her struggles were weak and useless. He tossed her to one of the creatures, and I could see the fire glint off her terror-stricken eyes, as she was taken the same way the kid had been. He carried humans to each one of those abominations. Wendigo was the name that kept coming to mind, but I really don't know what they were, or what they are. They didn't eat the people, but they ripped off the heads and drained the blood down their gullets, discarding the bodies to the center of the cave before going back to where they had entered. I waited until the last one started to leave, and I peeked around the edge of the opening. It disappeared into a circular hole in the floor. It just jumped in and was gone. The giant dragged the bloodless bodies to a pit and tossed them in. Then he gathered the heads and did the same. The dead eyes of a little boy stared coldly at me, accusing me, as the giant moved past the tunnel on his way to the pit. A dead stare unsettled me worse than anything I had seen. There were dozens more people in those cages. I could see movement. They weren't making any sounds, just huddling, it seemed. The giant picked through the corpses like a woman picking through the fruits at the supermarket, poking, pinching, sniffing. Then he left, dragging a headless body by one foot. I moved along the wall, going in the opposite direction the giant had gone. The cages were made of wood, and, well, although crude, they were sturdy, and the doors were fastened with chains. The people inside them cowered against the back walls as I tried to pull the chains free. They all sported large, dark bruises and a single puncture wound to the lower part of their throats. Maybe that's why they made no sounds. Their vocal cords were damaged. I couldn't get the chains loose. The giant emerged from an alcove and spotted me. I froze and stared at him, trembling. I was on his turf now. I had just seen how vile he and his friends were, and I wished I had never ventured into the tunnel. But I had. He blinked stupidly at me, probably surprised and shocked to see me in his lair. Amazingly, he grabbed a body from the pit, held it up, and chuckled. When I didn't move, he dropped the body and started toward me slowly. His expression changed to one of suspicion and anger as he walked. I opened fire, emptying a whole clip of ammo into its massive center. Each shot landed and blood poured from the wounds. Instead of falling and dying, the thing raced at me, screaming in anger. I ran toward the tunnel as I replaced the empty clip. I didn't go through the tunnel though. No way. Not with that thing giving chase. It would have been suicide. I turned and emptied that clip into its body. Some of the shots went wide and ricocheted off the high walls, but at least I had got enough lead in him to slow him down finally. He dropped near one of the fires, He grabbed me for one last time and his hand dropped into the flames, scorching and then catching fire. I used the ammo in the other clip to break the chains on the cages. The people were terrified and weak, and they emerged only after I threatened them. They acted as if they were in terror of me, and there I was, saving them. I just wanted to get the hell out of there before the other creatures came back and saw their food supply had been pillaged and their servant killed. I grabbed the smallest kid and dragged him toward the tunnel, yelling to the others to follow us if they wanted to live. One of the men grabbed my phone as they were filing out of my house, and he called 911. He dropped the phone in a bush by the front door. I had no clue why. The group shambled like a group of zombies down the street, dazed and dirty. I went back inside and threw some clothes and money into a duffel, and was headed out the front door when I heard the first sirens. Now the cops arrested me, and, well, yeah, I looked guilty, but I wasn't. I went peacefully, though. I only fought a little, but, who wouldn't? I knew, though, when they were finished interviewing the people I had freed, I would be released. I thought wrong. I told my side of the story, detail for detail. I even told them where to find the tunnel, everything. For some reason, the sick bastards decided I had tunneled to the cave and was using it to hide my nefarious activities like imprisoning people to kill so I could drink their blood and nosh on their corpses. They said the victims all supported their theory. They told me what a sick fuck I was, threatened me, and beat me. The more I stuck to my story, the worse it became. I don't know why the people I freed lied about everything, and I don't know what happened to the giant man's body that the police never found. What I do know is that I'm locked in a psychiatric prison with little hope of ever walking free again. That's why I've decided to pass the knowledge on to you. Those creatures are real as you or I. And they're still out there.